2,000 years ago, the Gospels tell us the Roman Empire crucified Jesus of Nazareth. His battered body was then wrapped in a simple burial shroud. For centuries, many believed this 14-foot piece of linen was that cloth. In 1988, science declared that it was impossible for the Shroud of Turin to be the burial cloth of Jesus Christ. It was only 700 years old. Sue Benford and Joe Marino offered the first real challenge to the carbon dating results. They believed that they had proved the carbon dating wrong because the section from where the samples were taken had been tainted with 16th century cotton fibers.
Our theory is that there's a mixture of 16th century cloth and 1st century cloth, and the data that we're finding on the cloth matches that theory.
Benford and Marino argue that carbon dating is wrong because the section from where the samples were taken had been contaminated with fibers from a later date. The herringbone weave that is so consistent throughout the main body of the shroud seemed misaligned, off-axis. If they're right, then the Shroud of Turin might just be what the faithful believe it to be.
I don't believe in miracles, no way.
Well, I'm skeptical when I'm listening to this, but they had taken photographs that were available of the samples taken for the carbon dating, and they had submitted these to several textile experts who didn't know they were looking at a photograph from the shroud, and each of these textile experts, independent of each other, said, you know, this looks rewoven. The samples taken for radiocarbon dating were cut from one corner of the shroud, adjacent to a seam. It was effectively an area that was damaged by someone cutting a piece out of it, possibly to sell as relic, so it needed to be repaired. I got a call from Ray, and he goes, what the hell is this? This is nonsense. I can prove these people wrong in 5 minutes. And I said, well, Ray, go for it.
So I read their paper, and I thought, I've got the samples that can shoot that full of holes. So I got out the Ross samples, and I got out the Shroud samples, and I went to work again.
A couple hours later, he calls me, and he goes, boy, he says, I can't believe it. He says, they were right. There's cotton here. He says, there's no cotton in the rest of the shroud, but there's cotton interwoven here. They must be right.
The authentic radiocarbon sample that I got, these segments of yarn were cut from the middle of the radiocarbon sample, so there was no question about them. And when I looked at these samples from the radiocarbon area, there's no problem at all finding cotton in them.
Rogers was now convinced that Benford and Marino had been right. In fact, he found other evidence they had missed, which proved the shroud had been repaired with cotton fibers in exactly the section where the carbon dating samples had been taken.
He writes a paper that's accepted for publication in Thermochemica Acta, January of 2005. And that paper is the only peer-reviewed science that challenges the carbon date with anything credible up until that point in time.
Rogers was perhaps the only person who could confirm this theory, as he had access to fibers from both the main body of the shroud and the carbon-dated section.
And if they had looked at any of the photographs that we had and studied the information we had as of 1978, they would have known that that was the worst possible place they could have taken a sample. I'm coming to the conclusion that it has a very good chance of being the piece of cloth that was used to bury the historic Jesus.
Ray Rogers' tests found that there were no pigments, no dyes, no binding agents typical of paint of any kind on the main body of the shroud, meaning the shroud could not have been painted or drawn. How had this image formed on the shroud?
In the late 1970s, scientists developed a computer program that allowed NASA technicians to read the terrain characteristics of distant planets derived from two-dimensional satellite photographs. But the developers of this amazing device were in for a shock when they were asked to analyze a photograph of something most of them had never even heard of. Actually, What they were looking at was a two-dimensional photograph of a two-dimensional artifact. But to everyone's amazement, from somewhere there emerged three-dimensional information. To these practical scientists, it was as if they were looking at something from another planet. None of them had ever seen anything like this before.
The VP-8 was the catalyst that caused the formation of the STIRP team. They said, we should see if we can figure out how this image was formed.
Peter Schumacher was a field engineer for the team that created the VP-8, which was originally designed to analyze images from medical resources and satellites.
Nobody in our company had ever even heard of the Shroud of Turin, let alone seen pictures or wanted to look at image analysis of the Shroud of Turin.
What the VP-8 analyzer does is plot the light and dark areas of an image onto a 3D grid.
The nose has a prominence, the cheeks roll off, the hair has a shape to it and is rounded. The whole image has dimension to it. The Shroud is a very unique image, the only one of its kind in the whole world. Nothing else like it. Three-dimensional relief, the front and the back of a whole human being. Only one in the world. No other.
There are other striking anomalies as well. For example, it has long been known that in addition to the explicit detail of the body image, there are also other images that were somehow transmitted onto the fabric, specifically the image of flowers.
I first noticed the image of flowers on the Shroud in 1985. And when I found what they looked like, then I began looking more closely and found that there were large numbers of these. I contacted Professor Avinoam Danin, the world's authority on the flowers of Israel, and took some of our photographs out there. When I handed the photograph that I'd first spotted the flowers on to him without indicating what we'd actually found, he looked at it for about 15 seconds and said, "Those are the flowers of Jerusalem." He immediately knew that this was a unique finding.
But once it was discovered that there were other images on the Shroud, Dr. Wanger began looking closer and found that there were small coins on each eye. What significance could that possibly have? Dr. Alan Wanger, in his book, The Shroud of Turin, Adventure and Discovery, points out that not only are they there, they present distinct and profound clues as to the date and origin of the image.
Father Francis Philus was professor of the theology as well as a scientist who investigated the Shroud of Turin, as well as a photographer. He was working with a group of researchers who were attempting to identify what the projections over the eyes were, thinking they might be coins. And Dr. Philus had enlargement made of the excellent photographs he had of the Shroud and noticed a patterning over the right eye. On enlargement of this, he noticed that there were letters which he interpreted as UCAI and something that looked like a shepherd's crook. This is typical of the lepton or the widow's mite struck by Pontius Pilate in the years in 29 AD to 33. We can identify the images of them, and so we can identify the particular coin and know the origin as well as the date, which both of them are, that we identify were struck in 29 AD. So this dates the Shroud back to the 1st century. It also localizes it to Israel, since these coins are just the widow's mites or the common penny of the time, and certainly would not circulate either outside of Israel or not very long after the reign of Tiberius Caesar, to which they were dedicated.
But how could an image containing so much information have been formed? There are those who believe the image could only have been formed by a burst of some sort of radiation. But the simple fact is, nothing like the Shroud image has ever been found or reproduced. But that's only the beginning of the astounding information to be gleaned from this amazing image.
The Shroud image is made from tiny fibers that are 1/10 the size of human hair. And the picture elements are actually randomly distributed like the dots in your newspaper photograph or magazine photograph. To do this, you would need an incredibly accurate atomic laser. This technology does not exist.
According to the official published findings of the STURP scientific team regarding the Shroud image, the actual image was created by a phenomenon as yet unknown, or a momentous event that caused a rapid cellulose degradation, aging, of the linen fibers. That is, an accelerated dehydration and oxidation of the very top linen fibrils of the cellulose fibers of the shroud, thereby creating a sepia or straw yellow colored image similar to that of a scorch. In other words, the image was caused by something, nobody knows what, that affected only the very top of the fibrils that make up the fibers that in turn make up the fabric.
After thousands of hours of intense study, the world was left with yet another scientific enigma. A piece of fabric that is demonstrably hand-woven containing a surface anomaly in the shape and form of a crucified man, created by some process of undetermined origin.
Could it be that the quantum revolution in physics permits science to go beyond human speculation? According to some physicists, the world is even more extraordinary than we thought. Oddly enough, this ordinary piece of linen cloth that many scientists believe to be over 2,000 years old might give scientists their most tangible clue to unlocking the secrets of the quantum hologram.